The message from my landlord didn't sound urgent at first. It was written in the same neutral tone landlords use when something has already been decided, short, practical, framed as information rather than negotiation. He said he would be changing the locks that afternoon and recommended I collect anything I needed beforehand. No explanation. Just timing. I reread the message twice, trying to understand whether it was routine maintenance or something closer to displacement. Urgency doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears as a sentence that assumes your life will rearrange around it. I stared at the clock on my screen, calculating distance between work hours and the moment access might disappear. There are situations that feel too personal to explain in detail but too immediate to ignore. This was one of them. Leaving early didn't feel like flexibility. It felt like logistics. When I asked my manager, I kept the explanation simple. My landlord was changing the locks. I needed to go before the end of the day. The phrasing sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, but I noticed how quickly the conversation slowed, the small pause that suggests information has shifted categories from casual to recordable. They asked me to send the request in writing so we could keep everything clear. Clear is a word that often means documented. I returned to my desk and typed the message carefully, aware that urgency can sound like unreliability if it isn't framed precisely. I didn't mention anxiety. I didn't mention uncertainty. Just timing and necessity. When I pressed send, relief lasted only a few seconds, because the reply arrived faster than expected. And it didn't sound like approval. The reply was polite, structured, and noticeably formal for what I thought was a simple request. My manager thanked me for the context and asked for a brief summary of my current priorities before leaving, just to ensure continuity. The language wasn't unreasonable. It was the tone that shifted the moment from accommodation to assessment. I began listing tasks, explaining timelines, clarifying what could wait until the next day. Writing it out made the situation feel heavier than it had when spoken. Urgency becomes measurable once it's documented: how much work is unfinished, how much notice was given, how easily absence can be absorbed. A few minutes later, HR was copied on the thread. The inclusion was framed as support, a way to help coordinate flexibility during unexpected personal disruptions. Support is a reassuring word until it appears beside documentation. Documentation suggests the moment will exist beyond the day itself. I tried to focus on finishing what I could before leaving, but my attention kept returning to the thread. Each message felt slightly more deliberate than the last. Clarifications about communication timing. Questions about previous schedule adjustments that had felt routine when they happened. Nothing accusatory. Just thorough. Thorough creates continuity. A coworker asked quietly if everything was okay after noticing the exchange. I said yes because nothing had actually gone wrong yet. A landlord changing locks is inconvenient, not catastrophic. At least that's how it sounded when simplified. But the structure forming around the request felt disproportionate. Near the end of the afternoon, a calendar notification appeared. A short meeting scheduled for the next morning. The title didn't reference my landlord. It referenced availability. The word availability stayed with me longer than the message from my landlord had. Availability sounds neutral, almost administrative, but it implies expectation, an invisible baseline that moments like mine are measured against. I opened the meeting invite twice, looking for context that wasn't there. Just HR, my manager, and 30 minutes positioned between routine check-ins. I told myself it was precautionary. Conversations help prevent misunderstandings. That's the language workplaces use when they want process to feel supportive rather than evaluative. Still, the speed at which the meeting appeared created a sequence that felt assembled rather than spontaneous. That evening, I reread the email thread and noticed phrasing I hadn't registered earlier. References to consistency. Clarification about notification timing. Questions framed as pattern rather than instance. The day hadn't changed, but its documentation suggested continuity that extended beyond it. My landlord texted again, confirming the locks would be changed before evening. The finality of that message made work feel distant for a moment. Personal urgency compresses perspective. Logistics replace interpretation. I gathered what I could, left earlier than usual, and told myself the meeting tomorrow would be procedural. Procedural means manageable. The next morning, my manager's first message arrived before I logged in, asking if I had access to stable workspace given the housing situation. The question sounded considerate, but its placement, before the meeting, felt preparatory. Preparation shapes conversation before it happens. I joined the call expecting clarification about flexibility. Instead, the discussion opened with a summary of recent schedule adjustments I hadn't realized were being grouped together. Grouped moments rarely stay isolated, and isolation had been how I understood them. The summary wasn't confrontational. That was what made it harder to interpret. My manager spoke in the same steady tone they used for project updates, referencing moments when timelines shifted, when I asked to adjust meetings, when communication happened later than expected. Each example felt reasonable in isolation. Hearing them presented consecutively created continuity I hadn't experienced. Continuity changes weight. HR emphasized they were seeking understanding, not assigning fault. The phrasing positioned the conversation as context gathering, but the structure suggested something closer to framing. My request about the locks wasn't the center of the discussion. It was the most recent entry in a list that already existed. I explained each instance, providing the same context I remembered: overlapping deadlines, unexpected delays, normal workplace variability. They listened carefully, occasionally noting phrasing that sounded neutral but carried permanence once written down. Documentation preserves explanation, but it also preserves association. After the call, I received a recap email summarizing themes rather than details. Availability consistency. Communication timing. Impact on coordination. The language felt broader than the moments themselves, as if meaning had expanded during the conversation. Daniel asked if the meeting was about the housing situation. I said partly. That answer felt incomplete, but I didn't know how to describe what the conversation had actually been about. Nothing specific had changed. The framing had. Framing creates trajectory. Later that afternoon, I opened my calendar and noticed another meeting scheduled for later in the week labeled check-in. The title sounded routine, but its placement, following the availability discussion, suggested sequence. Sequence turns moments into narrative, and narrative rarely stops after one entry. The check-in meeting arrived with the same neutral tone as the previous conversation, but neutrality felt different now that examples had begun accumulating. My manager opened by acknowledging the difficulty of unexpected personal disruptions, reinforcing that flexibility remained important. The reassurance sounded genuine. It also introduced the idea that flexibility required consistency to function. Consistency had become the central word. They revisited a few instances from the earlier summary, not to challenge my explanations but to connect them. Connections create pattern even when each moment remains reasonable alone. The lock situation surfaced again as context, understandable urgency that nonetheless affected availability. The phrasing didn't accuse. It categorized. Categorization creates reference. HR asked whether I felt expectations around schedule adjustments had been clearly communicated over time. The question sounded exploratory, but it shifted emphasis from circumstance to perception. Perception is difficult to document without simplifying it, and simplification often removes nuance. After the meeting, a document appeared in my inbox labeled Feedback Overview. It contained familiar examples arranged under themes that echoed the recap email. Seeing them written together created a coherence I hadn't felt while living through them. Coherence suggests progression. Daniel messaged asking if things were improving. I hesitated before answering because improvement implies resolution. What I felt was movement, not dramatic, not final, but directional. Later that evening, my landlord confirmed the locks had been changed. The message made the day feel heavier in retrospect. Personal urgency had intersected with something already forming at work, and the intersection had been recorded. Recorded moments don't disappear. They become starting points. And I was beginning to sense that this one wasn't isolated. The feedback overview looked calm on the surface: neutral language, familiar examples, reassurance that the goal was alignment rather than correction. But the organization changed how the moments felt. Separate requests, small delays, ordinary adjustments now appeared grouped under themes that suggested trajectory. Trajectory implies direction even when intention remains ambiguous. I read the document twice, searching for anything that felt inaccurate. Nothing did. That was the unsettling part. Accuracy doesn't prevent reinterpretation, it enables it. Context I experienced as circumstance appeared as consistency once arranged. The lock situation sat near the end of the overview, framed as the most recent example rather than the reason for the document itself. Placement matters. Final entries often look like confirmation regardless of their original meaning. I noticed HR asking me to acknowledge receipt through the system, not agreement, just confirmation that we had discussed the content. Confirmation transforms conversation into record. Records persist beyond memory. Daniel stopped by my desk, asking if the housing situation had settled. I said the locks were changed and I was figuring things out. Saying it aloud made the urgency feel smaller than it had during the day, but the documentation surrounding it remained unchanged. Work records don't scale with emotional intensity. They preserve sequence. Later that afternoon, I opened my profile page out of habit and saw the feedback overview attached there, timestamped and categorized. Categorization introduces permanence even when language remains flexible. My calendar notification arrived minutes later. A meeting labeled performance conversation. The wording didn't reference the overview, but the timing suggested connection. The performance conversation appeared routine at first, a 30-minute block, familiar attendees, language about ongoing development. Development suggests possibility. Still, sequence alters interpretation. Conversations that follow documentation rarely feel exploratory, even when framed that way. I joined the meeting expecting clarification about expectations moving forward. Instead, the discussion revisited the same themes from the overview with slightly firmer language. Communication timing became reliability. Schedule adjustments became availability pattern. The examples didn't change. Their framing did. Framing stabilizes narrative. I explained context again, careful not to sound defensive, aware that repetition can be interpreted as resistance when documentation already exists. HR acknowledged my explanations while noting the importance of predictability for coordination. Predictability is a standard that often becomes visible only after variability is recorded. After the meeting, the recap email arrived quickly, summarizing the conversation using phrasing that echoed the feedback overview almost exactly. Consistency across documents creates coherence that feels established rather than emerging. Daniel texted asking how it went. I told him it felt formal. Formal was the most accurate word, not hostile, not abrupt, just structured in a way that suggested the conversation belonged to a process already underway. That evening, I checked the system again and noticed additional notes attached to the overview referencing follow-up discussion completed. Completed implies progression even when outcomes remain unstated. My landlord situation had forced urgency into one day. Work had turned that urgency into sequence. And sequence rarely pauses once documentation begins. The next morning felt quieter than the days before, but quiet didn't mean still. Documentation creates movement that continues even when conversations pause. I opened the feedback overview again, this time noticing how often the same language appeared across entries: clarity, timing, predictability. Repetition builds pattern faster than new information does. I tried to recall how those moments felt while they were happening. Busy. Occasionally stressful. Ordinary in the way work often is when priorities shift. Seeing them grouped suggested intention where I remembered variability. Variability rarely survives summary. My manager's messages that day remained measured, polite, and noticeably structured. Updates included additional stakeholders, even for routine items. Visibility expanded without explanation. Expanded visibility changes how actions are interpreted because more people observe the same moment from different distances. Daniel mentioned leadership asking for team availability summaries, framed as standard coordination planning. The request sounded normal until placed beside my own documentation. Coordination creates comparison. Comparison creates narrative. Later that afternoon, HR sent a brief note asking whether the housing situation had impacted my workspace stability. The question sounded supportive, but its inclusion reinforced that personal urgency had become professional context. Context persists longer than crisis. I answered simply, I had temporary arrangements. Work continued as expected. The response felt factual, but facts don't control how patterns are constructed. They contribute to them. Before logging off, I noticed another calendar invite. This one labeled review preparation. Preparation suggests something approaching conclusion. And conclusions rarely arrive without rehearsal. The review preparation meeting was shorter than expected, which made its focus more noticeable. Instead of new examples, the conversation centered on organization, how previous feedback connected, which themes appeared consistently, what timeline best represented progression. Organization transforms information into narrative. Narrative feels definitive even when built from familiar pieces. HR shared a draft summary that looked similar to the overview, but arranged chronologically. Seeing the sequence laid out created a sense of inevitability I hadn't felt while living through the moments individually. Early adjustments. Midpoint clarifications. Recent urgency. The arc suggested direction rather than coincidence. I pointed out context for several entries, explaining circumstances that didn't appear in the summary. They noted the explanations while keeping the structure intact. Structure often survives nuance because it's designed to. After the meeting, the draft appeared in my inbox for reference. Reference implies readiness. Readiness implies proximity to decision without stating one. Daniel asked if the housing situation was still part of the conversation. I told him it was framed as recent context. Context can confirm narratives that existed beforehand without creating them. That evening, I reviewed the draft again and noticed something subtle. The earliest entry used phrasing that sounded observational, not evaluative. Later entries used language that implied expectation. The shift was gradual, but visible when placed side by side. Gradual shifts create certainty without obvious turning points. I closed the document realizing the lock day hadn't started the story. It had arrived at the moment the story needed confirmation. And confirmation changes how everything before it looks. The next document arrived under the label evaluation draft, a phrase that suggested movement beyond conversation. Draft implied flexibility, but evaluation implied direction. Seeing the two words together created tension that hadn't existed when feedback felt developmental. I opened it expecting new examples. Instead, it reorganized the same ones with firmer language. Observations became indicators. Clarifications became expectations. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was tonal. Tone stabilizes narrative more effectively than content. The lock incident appeared near the end again, framed not as the cause, but as the most visible instance of availability concerns. Visibility often determines which moment becomes symbolic, regardless of how ordinary it felt while happening. Symbolic moments anchor decisions. Daniel mentioned leadership discussing predictability across teams, a conversation broad enough to feel unrelated, but close enough in timing to matter. Organizational conversations often create frameworks that individual cases fit into later. Fit can look like inevitability. I noticed metadata showing multiple revisions in a short window, each change tightening phrasing without altering examples. Tightening signals preparation. Preparation suggests an audience beyond the current discussion. Later that afternoon, HR asked me to review the draft before the scheduled review meeting later in the week. The wording emphasized dialogue, but the structure suggested sequencing. Dialogue introduces possibilities. Sequencing introduces outcomes. I reread the document slowly, searching for inaccuracies rather than tone. Accuracy remained intact. Context felt compressed. Compression reduces variability, and reduced variability strengthens narrative. My calendar notification arrived before I finished reading. Review meeting confirmed. The duration was longer than previous conversations. Longer meetings rarely introduce uncertainty. They consolidate it. The review meeting began with appreciation, the same way every conversation had started. Appreciation creates continuity, reinforcing that what follows belongs to process rather than reaction. HR walked through the evaluation draft methodically, connecting themes that now sounded established rather than emerging. Communication timing. Availability consistency. Impact on coordination. Each theme referenced examples I recognized, arranged to suggest progression instead of circumstance. Progression creates momentum that individual moments rarely carry alone. I explained context again, aware that repetition can sound like resistance when documentation already exists. They acknowledged the explanations without altering the structure. Structure had become the center of the conversation. When they introduced the decision, the phrasing emphasized alignment rather than failure. The role required predictability that recent patterns suggested might not be sustainable. Predictability is difficult to dispute because it relies on interpretation of frequency rather than accuracy of events. The lock situation appeared once more, framed as confirmation of ongoing concern. Confirmation implies conclusion even when the example itself was situational. Situational moments rarely retain that distinction once narrative stabilizes. After the meeting, the termination email arrived quickly, containing the same document now labeled final. Finality often feels administrative when it follows extended preparation. The language didn't change. Its status did. I reread the earliest entry one more time and noticed something that hadn't stood out before. The first note used tentative phrasing that didn't match the certainty of later sections. The shift was subtle, but visible. Subtle shifts matter most when sequence becomes visible. Because sequence determines whether decisions feel inevitable or accelerated. I didn't react immediately after the termination email arrived. The decision had been introduced gradually enough that the final message felt like confirmation of a direction rather than a sudden change. Still, confirmation doesn't prevent questions from forming once momentum stops. I opened the evaluation again, this time reading it backward instead of forward. When sequence reverses, patterns look different. The lock incident, which had felt central in the final conversation, appeared less definitive when viewed as the most recent entry rather than the turning point. Placement influences meaning more than content does. I focused on the earliest notes, noticing how tentative they sounded compared to the final language. Words like observation and discussion appeared where later sections used consistency and expectation. The examples hadn't changed. Interpretation had matured around them. Daniel called that evening, asking how I was holding up. I explained the structure rather than the emotion because structure felt more revealing. He paused before mentioning that leadership had been discussing availability tracking weeks earlier, not in reference to me specifically, but as a broader coordination initiative. Initiatives create frameworks before cases exist. I reopened the document history and traced revisions backward. Early entries were sparse, spaced apart, almost exploratory. Density increased sharply around the week of my landlord message. The shift didn't prove cause. It suggested intersection. Intersection creates acceleration. I realized then that my request hadn't started the narrative. It had entered one already forming. That distinction didn't change the outcome, but it changed how inevitable it felt. I closed the file understanding something important had shifted. The decision hadn't been sudden, but the certainty around it might have been. The next morning, I requested my personnel file. The request felt procedural rather than confrontational, framed as clarification rather than challenge. Clarification allows questions to exist without accusation. Sometimes questions alone create movement. The file arrived as a compressed archive containing documents I recognized alongside metadata I hadn't seen before. Metadata strips language down to sequence, creation dates, revisions, approvals. Without narrative, sequence becomes easier to evaluate. I listed the timestamps beside each entry, noticing how early observations appeared isolated while later sections clustered tightly. Clustering suggests urgency even when examples themselves remain ordinary. Urgency influences interpretation. Daniel messaged saying leadership conversations had shifted toward process visibility rather than individual performance. Visibility matters when documentation creates outcomes that appear faster than understanding. Faster doesn't mean wrong. It means noticeable. I found a note referencing availability monitoring initiated before the lock incident, phrased broadly enough to apply across teams. Broad language allows specific cases to fit without appearing targeted. Fit can resemble inevitability when sequence isn't examined closely. I compared the monitoring note with the evaluation timeline and saw how the two overlapped. Monitoring existed first. Evaluation followed. The lock day sat between them, not as the beginning, but as the moment convergence became visible. Convergence accelerates narrative. My phone buzzed with a follow-up message from HR about timeline clarification discussions. The wording remained neutral, but the existence of the discussion suggested something beyond finality. Final decisions rarely include clarification. Clarification belongs to sequence. And sequence had started to matter more than conclusion. I opened the personnel file again with less focus on what had been written and more on how entries moved over time. Sequence has rhythm, long gaps, sudden density, moments where observation becomes classification without announcement. The rhythm around my timeline shifted noticeably after the lock incident, but the first signals existed earlier. The monitoring note Daniel mentioned appeared broader than my situation, referencing team availability patterns rather than individual performance. Broad framing creates flexibility later. When individual cases emerge, they can appear aligned with an existing concern rather than initiating one. Alignment changes perception. I traced the earliest observation tied to communication timing and noticed it had been revised multiple times without changing content. The revisions tightened phrasing, removing uncertainty that earlier versions contained. Uncertainty disappearing doesn't change events. It changes confidence. Daniel called during his commute, saying leadership discussions sounded careful, not defensive. Careful language often signals attention to process rather than disagreement about outcome. Process becomes central when sequence carries implications beyond one decision. After we hung up, I noticed an approval marker attached to the monitoring entry indicating progression to review preparation shortly after my request to leave early. The proximity didn't prove cause, but it suggested acceleration. Acceleration becomes visible only when earlier pacing is slow enough to notice contrast. HR's follow-up email referenced timeline reconciliation as routine practice, language designed to frame movement as standard rather than exceptional. Standard adjustments rarely draw attention unless sequence makes them visible. I realized my request hadn't created scrutiny. It had intersected with it. Intersection doesn't determine direction, but it influences speed. And speed changes how inevitable outcomes feel. Timeline reconciliation sounded administrative, but its presence shifted the conversation from explanation to structure. Structure determines how confidently conclusions can be presented later. If structure appears uneven, certainty requires reinforcement. I exported the metadata into a simple list again, removing language until only order remained. Without narrative, the pattern looked less cohesive than the documents suggested. Early monitoring appeared intermittent. Review preparation appeared quickly. Evaluation stabilized shortly after. The distance between stages felt compressed. Compression creates inevitability after the fact. Daniel texted that leadership discussions now included phrases like sequencing integrity and documentation alignment. Those phrases don't question feedback itself. They question how feedback became decision. The distinction matters because sequence governs defensibility more than interpretation does. I noticed a subtle detail in the approval markers. Review preparation was logged before several explanatory notes were finalized. Preparation preceding explanation doesn't invalidate conclusions. It introduces tension between readiness and understanding. Tension invites clarification. HR asked whether I could provide additional context about the day my landlord changed the locks, specifically communication timing rather than circumstances. Timing influences narrative because it establishes cause even when cause remains ambiguous. I described the urgency as clearly as I could, focusing on sequence rather than emotion. Emotion rarely enters documentation cleanly. Sequence always does. After sending the response, I reread the timeline again and saw how the lock incident functioned differently depending on placement. Early placement made it trigger. Later placement made it confirmation. Confirmation suggests decision already forming. My phone buzzed with a calendar invite labeled outcome discussion. Outcome had been delivered. which meant the discussion was about order. And order determines whether endings remain stable. The outcome discussion sat on my calendar like a placeholder for something that hadn't decided its direction yet. The decision itself hadn't been withdrawn, but the presence of discussion suggested the explanation surrounding it remained flexible. Flexibility rarely appears after finality unless sequence introduces uncertainty. I reviewed the metadata again, this time focusing on transitions rather than entries. Monitoring to review preparation. Preparation to evaluation. Evaluation to decision. Each step looked logical on paper, but the spacing between them varied more than the narrative suggested. Variability doesn't negate process. It complicates inevitability. Daniel said leadership conversations sounded quieter, not because interest had faded, but because language had become precise. Precision appears when timing matters more than interpretation. Interpretation can be debated. Timing cannot. I noticed an annotation attached to the review preparation entry referencing retrospective categorization. Retrospective doesn't change observation. It assigns meaning later. Meaning assigned later can make earlier moments appear directional even when they felt exploratory at the time. That afternoon, HR asked whether I remembered when communication about availability first felt evaluative rather than collaborative. The question surprised me because it acknowledged perception as part of sequence integrity. Integrity includes how transitions feel, not only when they are logged. I described the shift as gradual, no single moment, just increasing certainty in language. Certainty accumulates quietly until it becomes visible all at once. When I closed the email, I realized the discussion wasn't about whether feedback existed. It was about when feedback became conclusion. Daniel's message arrived minutes later. They're comparing readiness to documentation. Readiness appearing early changes how decisions are understood. The comparison between readiness and documentation reframed everything without challenging the outcome directly. If readiness, presentation language, structured summaries, consolidated themes appeared before documentation fully stabilized, sequence could look accelerated even when examples remained accurate. I reopened the draft history and saw how phrasing tightened across revisions, moving from exploratory language toward definitive framing before several explanatory notes were finalized. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Cumulative shifts create certainty without visible turning points. Daniel mentioned leadership referencing process coherence, a phrase that surfaces when sequence carries implications beyond one case. Coherence depends on alignment between preparation and formalization. Misalignment doesn't invalidate conclusions. It makes them harder to position as inevitable. I noticed the presentation file had been locked shortly before my termination meeting while review notes continued updating afterward. Locking stabilizes narrative. Updating afterward suggests understanding was still evolving. Stabilization preceding evolution introduces tension. HR's follow-up referenced remediation pathways in neutral terms, framing them as standard adjustments when documentation visibility creates ambiguity. Ambiguity invites clarification, and clarification slows certainty. I reread the timeline one more time and recognized something subtle. The moment my landlord changed the locks wasn't when scrutiny began. It was when readiness met circumstance. That intersection gave existing momentum visible confirmation. Confirmation accelerates narrative. Daniel texted again. They're asking whether certainty formed before process completed. Certainty forming early doesn't change what happened. But it changes how confidently the ending can remain final. And confidence had started to shift. I stopped rereading the evaluation itself and focused entirely on transition markers, the moments where language shifted from observation to decision. Those shifts rarely appear dramatic. They exist in small edits, approval flags, documents labeled draft one day and final the next. Sequence reveals those changes more clearly than content ever does. The earliest monitoring entries still sounded tentative when isolated, but the first instance of evaluative phrasing appeared attached to a summary rather than a new example. Summary assigns meaning retroactively. It tells the story of progression even when progression felt uneven in real time. Daniel said leadership discussions were now centered on classification, when availability concerns moved from general observation into formal review. Classification determines consequence. If classification appears close to confirmation, escalation can feel accelerated even when observations were valid. I mapped the classification entry beside my landlord timeline and saw how closely they sat. My request didn't initiate monitoring. It coincided with classification. Coincidence can resemble causation when sequence is compressed. HR shared a timeline overview ahead of the outcome discussion, outlining monitoring, review preparation, evaluation, decision. Seeing the stages together clarified structure while exposing pacing. Early stages stretched across weeks. Later stages clustered within days. Clustering alters perception of inevitability. I highlighted the gap between first observation and formal review, noticing how much interpretation occurred within that space. Interpretation stabilizes narrative. Stabilization invites confidence. Confidence preceding completion introduces tension. Daniel texted that leadership was mapping inflection points. Inflection points don't change events. They change trajectory. And trajectory determines whether endings appear earned or expedited. The outcome discussion opened with structure rather than conclusion. HR walked through the timeline overview carefully, emphasizing that feedback validity wasn't under question. The focus was sequencing, how monitoring transitioned into evaluation, and whether communication timing aligned with internal readiness. Readiness had become the central word. I asked when evaluation language first appeared relative to review initiation. HR referenced consolidation as the moment patterns became visible, which made evaluation necessary. Necessary implies inevitability, but inevitability depends on pacing that appears consistent. I compared the overview with my metadata list and noticed how consolidation preceded formal review documentation by only a short interval. Short intervals don't prove acceleration. They invite examination. Examination shifts confidence from assumption to verification. Daniel texted during the call that leadership conversations were using the phrase process exposure. Exposure occurs when internal progression becomes externally visible. Visibility doesn't change events. It changes how they must be explained. HR acknowledged documentation density increased around the time of my landlord request, describing it as clarification rather than initiation. Clarification suggests understanding existed earlier. Initiation suggests change. The distinction shaped narrative responsibility without altering the outcome itself. After the call, I reread the timeline again and recognized how differently the stages felt depending on placement. Monitoring looked exploratory. Evaluation looked certain. The distance between exploratory and certain appeared shorter than expected. Short distances create the impression of inevitability. But inevitability depends on sequence that withstands visibility. And visibility had started to reveal pacing that required explanation. The more I looked at the timeline, the less it felt like a story about one day, and the more it felt like a story about momentum. Momentum doesn't announce itself while it's forming. It becomes visible only when something interrupts its pace. My landlord changing the locks hadn't created momentum. It had revealed it. I compared draft summaries with final versions again, watching how tentative language disappeared over time. Words like monitoring and discussion gave way to consistency and expectation. Nothing inaccurate replaced them. Certainty simply arrived faster than I remembered the conversation's feeling. Daniel said leadership discussions were now referencing pacing across similar reviews, not to dispute this one but to establish context. Context protects process. If pacing appears compressed relative to expectation, explanation becomes necessary even when conclusions remain defensible. I noticed another subtle detail in the metadata. Presentation preparation began before several explanatory notes were finalized. Preparation doesn't decide outcomes, but it signals direction. Direction preceding completion introduces tension between readiness and process. HR's follow-up emphasized sequence clarification as routine, framing movement as adjustment rather than reconsideration. Adjustment preserves narrative while allowing structure to shift. Structure often matters more than outcome in determining stability. I reread the timeline and saw how the lock incident functioned differently depending on perspective. From my side, it was urgency. From documentation, it was confirmation. Confirmation stabilizes narrative because it appears to validate existing concerns. Daniel texted. They're asking when the story felt finished internally. Internal completion can precede external delivery without intention. But when it does, sequence becomes visible. And visible sequence rarely leaves certainty unchanged. The internal drafts revealed that completion rarely arrives in a single moment. It accumulates through phrasing, summaries, and preparation that gradually remove uncertainty from earlier notes. Seeing those drafts felt like watching certainty form rather than discovering it fully formed. The earliest versions framed themes as emerging. Later versions framed them as established. The examples didn't change. Their weight did. Weight determines how decisions are presented, as possibility or inevitability. Daniel said leadership conversations had shifted toward documentation alignment, a phrase that surfaces when readiness and formalization don't perfectly coincide. Alignment doesn't question substance. It questions order. Order governs defensibility. I compared draft timestamps with approval markers and saw that presentation language stabilized shortly before formal review initiation was logged. The difference was small, but small differences define sequence integrity. Integrity depends on whether progression appears consistent when examined closely. HR's note referenced remediation pathways without specifying direction, language designed to preserve neutrality while acknowledging structural movement. Movement rarely occurs without reason, even when reason remains procedural. I reread the drafts again, noticing how each revision reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity protects flexibility. Removing it creates momentum. Momentum can feel inevitable once visible, even if it formed gradually. Daniel texted again. They're asking if certainty outpaced documentation. Outpacing doesn't invalidate decisions, but it changes how they must be explained. Because explanation relies on sequence that appears coherent. And coherence had started to require adjustment rather than assumption. The phrase certainty outpacing documentation stayed with me because it described something I had felt without being able to name. Decisions rarely emerge fully formed. They accumulate weight until delivery becomes possible. The question wasn't whether that accumulation was appropriate. It was whether its timing appeared aligned with process. I placed the presentation drafts beside the review initiation marker again, noticing how language had already stabilized before formal review documentation reflected that same confidence. The gap wasn't dramatic, but it existed. Small gaps become significant when sequence determines how outcomes are defended. Daniel said leadership conversations were focusing on visibility, when internal readiness became externally observable. Visibility creates accountability not for decisions themselves, but for how they unfold. If readiness appears early, narrative must work harder to explain pacing. HR asked whether the termination meeting felt conclusive compared to earlier feedback discussions. The question acknowledged perception as part of sequence integrity. Integrity doesn't require reversal. It requires coherence between preparation and delivery. I described the meeting as resolved rather than exploratory, which felt accurate without challenging the content. Resolution suggests completion. Seeing drafts that still contained hesitation complicated that impression. I reviewed the metadata again and noticed the presentation file had been locked before several explanatory revisions were finalized. Locking stabilizes narrative. Continued revision afterward suggests understanding was still evolving. Stabilization preceding evolution creates tension that documentation alone cannot smooth over. Daniel texted. They've identified the inflection point. Inflection points aren't where decisions happen. They're where decisions begin to feel difficult to undo. And once that moment appears early, sequence becomes the story. The inflection point appeared quietly in the workflow record, formal review initiation logged after the presentation narrative had already reached near final phrasing. The order didn't contradict feedback. It reframed how momentum developed. Momentum had formed first. Formalization followed. Momentum preceding formalization introduces exposure. I stared at the record longer than anything else because it shifted the termination meeting from decision moment to delivery moment. Delivery can feel inevitable even when sequence remains adjustable. Adjustment becomes necessary when readiness appears before process completion. Daniel called, his voice careful. Leadership wasn't disputing the feedback, he said. They were examining whether sequence created the appearance of predetermined direction. Appearance matters because organizations defend process as much as outcome. Predetermined is rarely stated directly. It's inferred from pacing. I compared timestamps again: presentation lock, review initiation, termination delivery. The order didn't invalidate the story. It destabilized its inevitability. Instead of escalation leading to certainty, certainty appeared to lead escalation. HR's follow-up referenced sequence reconciliation, language that allows structural correction without challenging substance. Reconciliation restores coherence rather than reversing events. Coherence determines whether endings hold under visibility. I realized the day my landlord changed the locks hadn't been used incorrectly. It had been used at the moment momentum needed confirmation. Confirmation accelerated narrative. But the record showing when certainty formed made that acceleration visible. And visibility prevents endings from remaining unquestioned. The decision still existed. Its timing no longer felt final. The reconciliation conversation didn't sound like reversal. It sounded like adjustment. HR explained that sequence review identified areas where presentation readiness appeared ahead of formal review documentation. Not an error in feedback. A visibility gap in process. The distinction allowed movement without challenging the decision's substance. Movement framed as continuity rarely attracts attention. They described reinstatement as a step to restore process alignment while documentation sequencing was finalized. Temporary language, procedural reasoning, but the meaning existed beneath it. My role hadn't been returned because the narrative changed. It had been returned because the order supporting that narrative required correction. Daniel texted during the call. They're fixing structure, not story. Structure determines whether stories hold. HR outlined next steps: access restoration, responsibilities resumed, timeline clarified with revised sequencing guidance. Every phrase emphasized integrity rather than reconsideration. Integrity allows organizations to maintain conclusions while adjusting how those conclusions are positioned. I reopened the metadata after the call. Nothing about the entries had changed. Presentation still preceded review initiation. Delivery still followed both. Sequence remained intact. What shifted was how that sequence would be explained moving forward. Explanation stabilizes outcomes. I realized the termination meeting hadn't been invalid. It had been premature in structure. Premature doesn't negate reasoning. It interrupts inevitability. Once inevitability weakens, adjustment becomes procedural rather than exceptional. The call ended without apology, but with access returning. Sometimes correction happens quietly because sequence makes silence possible. And silence can change direction without changing language. The first day back felt less like return and more like continuation adjusted slightly out of alignment. My desk looked unchanged, systems restoring access in the same order they had removed it. Continuity masks correction effectively. When movement resembles routine, narrative remains stable. Daniel nodded when he saw me, confirming what had already circulated quietly. Conversations resumed with subtle differences, expectations clarified earlier, documentation shared sooner, transitions explained before summaries appeared. Sequence made visible reshapes behavior without announcement. I logged into the workspace and watched permissions repopulate, timestamps marking restoration as precisely as removal had been recorded. Systems preserve order without interpretation. Interpretation emerges afterward, shaped by how that order is positioned. I opened the timeline one last time, not searching for justification but recognizing its role. The day they used as confirmation had become the day sequence exposed acceleration. The lock incident hadn't protected me. It had revealed pacing. Pacing required explanation. Explanation created adjustment. HR's follow-up framed reinstatement as continuity pending final sequence reconciliation. Pending remained, but certainty had shifted. My experience now existed alongside documentation rather than beneath it. Parallel narratives resist definitive endings. I understood then that they hadn't fired me because I needed to leave early. They fired me because momentum had already formed. What they didn't expect was that the record of that momentum, the order in which certainty appeared, would make the ending unstable. They ended my role using one urgent day. The timeline turned that day into the reason it couldn't stay ended.